Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on the critique of open theism, rabbinic theology, and open theism. So we're starting our main event of how do we address this issue of open theism by looking at how the rabbis and how the early church essentially understood the nature and character of God with regard to sovereignty. Now, this chapter is written by Russell Fuller, and we'll go ahead and talk about why we would want to start our discussion here. And the reason is because the real battleground, or the real fight, or theological debate between those who hold an openness theistic view and the traditional view occurs in the Old Testament, in the Mosaic, in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Tanakh. That's where the debate happens. That's where a lot of the verses that we're looking at with regard to whether or not God knows the future are found. And so the openness view is going to essentially challenge the nature and character of God. And many people who hold to the openness view champion the idea, well, we have the right nature and character of God, and if you understand the true nature and character of God, then that's the most important thing. And the Calvinists, well, I would agree, nature and character of God is vitally important to understanding of who God is, but I would disagree that openness is the correct view. So it's important to us then to also understand that both sides are going to claim to adhere to Scripture or the Bible. And what's interesting is when you look at the Judeo-Christian lineage of theology, there are certain things you'd expect to change dramatically. There are other things you wouldn't. So for example, I would expect in Judeo-Christian theology, at least in conservative theology, that the Jewish rabbis and ancient texts, etc., from Judaism would have, for the most part, a similar view of God's nature and character in terms of attributes. And they might break it up a little bit differently, might talk about it a little differently, but fundamentally, we're using the same data, we're using the same material. I would expect them to have at least some level of consistency. Second, there's going to be things like the Trinity. Obviously, we're going to have very different doctrine on that. Christology, obviously, very different doctrine on that. But certain types of things, for example, the nature of man, anthropology, I think they probably are going to have a very similar view, being both body, and actually I know they do because I've researched it, but being both body and soul, two things which are both good things. Not that people are good, people are sinful, but the idea that the body is not evil, the body is a good thing, it's a gift from God, and the soul is a good thing. Okay? So it's interesting that there are certain areas in rabbinic thought that we would have connection on. And so the idea, and I'll go ahead and quote the book here, quote, under rabbinic scrutiny and examination, the openness view fails, its lethal errors are exposed, its inaccurate claims concerning history, theology, and exegesis repudiated. And so the argument here is that we could actually use the early rabbis, the Talmud, the Midrash, to potentially kind of act as a referee. Like, are people interpreting the Old Testament scripture or verses as they should be? Again, it's not a perfect argument in the sense that they're fallible people too, but in general, what types of things are we seeing? Are we seeing more open theistic views in the early church and in the rabbinic teachings, or are we seeing things that agree more or less with the idea of the sovereignty of God? So let's go ahead and dive into this. What then are the historical claims of the openness view? So open theists object to challenging the impartiality of the rabbis. Okay? So in other words, they're going to say, the rabbis were probably wrong. Now, John Sanders, who's an advocate for the openness view, claims that Greek philosophy influenced both Christian and Jewish thinking about God. And he argues that this is a form of Hellenistic rational theology. In other words, it's going to be the theology of Plato, it's going to be the theology of Aristotle, it's going to be the theology of essentially these early Greek thinkers. And he also argues that the classical view of God, that's essentially the view that pretty much has been orthodox for 2,000 years, not 2,000 years exactly. There's getting it sorted out in the first couple hundred years, but it's been the orthodox view for a very long time. That view is worked out in Western tradition, is actually in disagreement with Scripture at several key issues, key points. Now, I want to go ahead and make this claim here real quick, which is, it's possible that's the case. We should investigate if someone's going to charge it with that. But I would like to claim that the odds of doctrine of God being fundamentally wrong at several key points throughout the majority of Christian history is very low. Now, to be sure, there are aberrations of the doctrine of God at various points. There's no question about that. There's people that got it wrong. But there's a standing body of evidence that the classical view is actually the majority view throughout history. And not only that, but it was actually consistent with the rabbis in Judaism as well. So, and by the way, when people say we worship the same God as the God of Judaism, what they're talking about is attributes and character and nature. There's the issue that there's a rejection of Jesus. Okay, and I'm not trying to like say that, oh, it's the same thing. No, there's a rejection of Jesus, and that's a very serious problem, right? But it is important to note that in terms of attributes, there's actually a substantial amount of overlap. Now, Sanders is going to claim that Philo, a Jewish Hellenist, essentially bridges the gap between Greco-Roman philosophy and the Old Testament and the Old Testament. And that this affects Christian philosophy. However, modern rabbinic authorities deny that Greek philosophy influenced the rabbis. Why? Well, the old rabbis had no interest or training in that. There's no record of that. They had only a casual acquaintance with Greek thought. And the idea of God within Judaism is firmly developed from the scriptures when you actually read the works. It's like, no, they're getting this from various verses, not from Greco-Roman thought. And contemporary philosophy found in Hellenistic Jewish writings, for example, like in Wisdom of Solomon, 4th Maccabees, and Philo, is not the normative Jewish understanding. It's not normative of Judaism. Those do exist, but that's not the norm for rabbinic thought, nor is the influence of other religions. And so, for example, this differed greatly from Egyptian Jewry because they tried to combine essentially Greek thought and Judaism. And you see the same thing in the early church, by the way, with Origen. Origen, also from Alexandria, also from the region of Egypt, essentially is going to try to mix Greco-Roman thought and philosophy and Christianity. And that actually is what leads to things like replacement theology. It's what leads to a lot of the problematic ideas that we see in Gnosticism. And so actually, when you do mix Greek thought with Christianity, you end up coming out with some very, very bad theology. But it's precisely because they didn't that their theology is what it is. The rabbis typically only mention one prominent Greek philosopher, and that was Epicurus. And they basically say that he is the, quote, embodiment of infidelity and symbol of heresy. So not a positive look. One rabbi's quote is saying, "Go then and find a time that is neither day nor night, and then learn Greek wisdom." So they did not have a very positive view of this stuff. Now, Greek philosophers essentially trusted in reason and the senses. In other words, when you look at Greek philosophers, you're either going to see an experientialist aspect or experimentalist aspect. In other words, the five senses tell us the truth, or you're going to find that reason is where truth comes from. But the rabbis believed that truth originated in God and the prophets. This is why theological method is so important, because theological method essentially holds that as its foundation, that God and his word are the foundation of truth, rather than reason or the senses. Now, Greek philosophers believed in their idea of a pagan God was subject to law, nature, and fate. In other words, he was a finite God, he or she was a finite God. There were many of them. They were subject to the world and to creation. They weren't over it. And they were also subject to fate. They didn't direct or guide fate. So very much in the Greek philosophy realm, you would have open theism fit actually very well, because the Greek gods were simply not able to see the future. Now, sometimes they could see little things, prophecies and stuff like that, oracles, but it was often muddled. It was often vague. You even go into the Norse gods, and part of the thing is Odin's quest for knowledge and things like that. So actually, far from the Christian God, it would actually make sense if there was a syncretizing with Greco-Roman thought, or if there's a syncretizing with some of these other religions. Then you would get an open theistic view of the Christian God, not the other way around. Greek philosophers also generally rejected supernaturalism, providence, and creation ex nihilo. Again, when you get into Greek thought, they had ways of talking about deity or divinity and things like that, but you get the very common picture that they probably didn't believe that the actual Roman or Greek pantheon was real. Okay, they tended to reject supernaturalism, and they also sort of believed that whatever happens, happens. That there's this thing called providence, where the idea that God is directing things was not really part of their language. They, again, held to more, whatever happens, happens type of a situation. Whereas the rabbis very much accepted all three of these. They would accept a supernatural worldview, they believed in divine providence or God's interaction with the world, and they also believed in creation ex nihilo. Now, occasionally, there were some similarities. So, for example, certain monotheistic ideas. Some of the Greek philosophers did kind of tap into a monotheistic vein at times. So there were some ideas that did cross over. However, we would argue that this was more happenstance as opposed to things being based on each other. Some have said that Greek and Rabbinic thought are like oil and water. They cannot mix. And historians tend to affirm this segregation of thought. The rabbis who invented Judaism in the 2nd century, and we have to understand that you essentially have Judaism as it is in the temple period, the first temple and second temple, in other words, where it's a full kingdom, the nation of Israel, the kingdom of Israel. Then you have Judaism in the exile, looks very different. And then you have Judaism in the Second Temple period. And then you have Judaism after the fall of the Second Temple. And so you have these very distinct phases of Judaism. And the reason is because when you're in exile or when the temple's destroyed, you don't have a place to do the majority of the Torah. You don't have the temple and the sacrifices. So they often came up with other ways to sort of make this meaningful in their societies over time. And this especially happened after the Second Temple fell. And then again, it even happened even more so around 1000 AD, where you have some very, very serious rabbinic scholars operating around 1000 AD, some of whom we're going to talk about tonight. But they had a great influence on Judaism going forward over the last 1000 years. Now, when they invented what we would call Judaism in the 2nd century, they did not do so based on Plato. But what they actually did was they were trying to figure out, again, how do we live out without a temple, essentially. And they held that categories of purity established in their oral teachings and scriptures were the structures according to which God conducted the world. In other words, it's now going to be about purity. And so there's a whole slew of different laws and things that are going to be developed as a result of that. And what we see is that Philo cannot bridge Greek philosophy with Rabbinic theology. He had little to no influence on the rabbis, and Philo's work only became known through Christian copyists. So those are some interesting points as well. Sanders, however, appeals to two different authorities to defend his thesis, H.P. Owen and G.L. Prestige. And Owen argues that the fathers in Philo used Greek philosophy for the expression and amplification of the divine attributes that scriptures teach. In other words, Owen argues that all of the attributes are implied in the Bible, like omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, etc., but their amplification was due to Greek philosophy. So in other words, yes, he knows all, but he doesn't know the future, right? Yes, he's all-powerful, but he can't do anything, right? So it's this idea that the amplification of these attributes were due to Greek philosophy. Interestingly enough, he actually doesn't say that Greek philosophy distorted or corrupted scriptures and our doctrine. Instead, he equates classical theism with Christian theism, and that it essentially comes from biblical revelation. So he's going to say that, Greek thought maybe emphasized these attributes more, but he would argue that they're all in there. G.L. Prestige never claims that the fathers derived their theism from classical biblical synthesis. He argues the fathers inherited Hebrew theism, interestingly enough, and that the main trunk of the Christian idea of God is that these divine perfections or these attributes come from the Hebrew prophets, not from Plato. So it's interesting. Yes, there might have been Greek influence, but not on the actual theology. It's just on how we talk about it, potentially how we emphasize certain things, but not actually the theology itself. The argument there is, from history, it seems like it actually comes right from the Hebrew scholars and rabbis, which makes perfect sense. Christianity and Judaism does represent a disjunct. There's no question. You have the disjunct between law and the gospel. You have the disjunct between the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament in terms of the testaments, right? There are some disjuncts. There are some discontinuities. But there are also a lot of continuities. The God in both is the same. His attributes must be the same. Jesus, while we see him in flesh in the New Testament, is present in the Mosaic, in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew scriptures. So, yes, there's a disjunct in terms of law and gospel, in terms of the Mosaic covenant and the New Covenant, but that doesn't mean that there's like this hard division between the OT and the NT to the point of it's two separate gods or it's, two totally separate lines of thinking and theology. No, it's not. When we go and create theology, when we go and make theology, we use the entire Bible to do so, not just one testament or the other. So Sanders' historical claims and appeals do not seem to bear real fruit. It seems like he's trying to overstretch what people actually say. So let's move into the theological claims of the openness view. So the openness view is going to recognize that Judaism and Christianity maintain the traditional view of God. And here's the problem. A lot of people do this. We saw this happen with Michael Heiser. We saw this happen with a number of different folk over the years. This happened with Richard Rohr, where essentially someone comes along, or a small group of people come along, say everybody else was wrong. I'm the only right one. When you have that situation happen, and then you also have a real hard time linking it to history. So, for example, yes, dispensational came, but there's a substantial amount of the early church that held to some form of a messianic kingdom, whether it be exactly 1,000 years or whatnot. It's irrelevant. The fact is that, yeah, they didn't hold to church replaces Israel. Okay, so here we have this view where it's like massive red flag. Why? Everyone from the start has misread and misunderstood God. That's never a good thing. And so what we see is the modern rabbinic authorities describe the rabbinic view of divine providence, foreknowledge, and even foreordination literally to a level of an Augustinian Calvinist. Like, it's impressive when you actually get in there how much they hold to divine providence, foreknowledge, and foreordination. So let's take a look at from Kaufman Kohler, and we're going to see what is said here. This is Kaufman Kohler depicts God's sovereign rule over human affairs as follows, quote, God is a ruler of a moral government. Thus he directs all the acts of men toward the end which he has set. Judaism is most sharply contrasted with heathenism at this point. Heathenism either deifies nature or merges deity into nature. There is no place for a God who knows all things and provides for all in advance. On the other hand, Judaism sees in all things not the fortuitous dealings of blind and relentless fate, but the dispensations of a wise and benign providence. It knows of no event which is not foreordained by God. A divine preordination decides a man's choice of his wife and every other important step of his life. That's pretty heavy duty. It's pretty heavy duty. All right, let's go ahead and read some more, because again, we're going to read a number of these here. Let's take a look at the next quote. This says, G.F. Moore describes rabbinic view. Quote, nothing in the universe could resist God's power or thwart his purpose. His knowledge embraced all that was or is to be. The history of the world is his great plan in which everything moves to the fulfillment of his purpose. The end that is in his mind. Not only the great whole, but every moment, every event, every individual, every creature is embraced in this plan, and it is an object of his particular providence. All man's ways are directed by God. He cites Psalm 37, 23, Proverbs 20, 24. A man does not even hurt his finger without its having been proclaimed above that he should do so. So again, this is his description of the rabbinic stuff. It's very strong. Another one, tension between divine sovereignty and free will does not lessen foreknowledge or foreordination. Here we go. Quote, that man is capable of choosing between right and wrong, and of carrying the decision into action was not questioned, nor was any conflict discovered between this freedom of choice with its consequences and the belief that all things are ordained and brought to pass by God in accordance with his wisdom, his righteous and benevolent will. Interesting. Ephraim Urbach declares, quote, the Gemara deduces that the deeds of man that are performed with understanding and in conformity with the laws of ethics and the precepts of religion can assure the desired results only if they accord with the designs of providence, which knoweth what the future holds. Alan J. Avery Peck writes, while thus avowing the existence of free will, the rabbis generally focus on the idea that, from the beginning, God knew how things would turn out, such that all is predestined. This idea emerges from a comprehension that the world was created as a cogent whole, with its purpose pre-existing the actual creation. The rabbis thus understood all that was needed to accomplish God's ultimate purpose, having been provided from the beginning of time. In the rabbinic view, there are no surprises for God. All is in place and ready for the preordained time to arrive. That's like I said, I mean, that's like Augustinian Calvinist type of thing. That's essentially full on, foreordination, full on foreknowledge, full on, God's will and sovereignty. I mean, it's really hard to even break away from that with how strong that is. And so the question then is, where did the rabbis get these thoughts? Was it Greek philosophy? Well, they tell us in the rabbis they get these ideas from the Hebrew scriptures. So where did the early church fathers and the church get its view? The Hebrew scriptures. It's continuous in that sense. The open theistic argument is that the OT has been misread from the beginning for the most part, and there's no evidence for this incorporation of Greek philosophy into Christian theology in the early church fathers. And Sanders and Boyd both claim the infection then was earlier, that happened earlier. Now, what about so again, the problem here is these early the rabbis, I mean, it's very clear, like they believed in sovereignty, and they saw no contradiction between a person being able to choose a choice and God's sovereignty, interestingly enough. So what about the exegetical claims of the openness view? So the openness view hinges on their specific interpretation of anthropomorphisms in the Old Testament. Now, here's the deal. We are going to spend a lot of time on that in the future. This is just sort of, taking a look at the rabbinic thought for a little bit here. We're going to spend, like I said, about a half hour total. We're getting close to wrapping up. But we're taking a look at just the rabbis. Then we're going to go in and we're going to dive into all these scriptures. But in general, it gets really hard to make this claim that everybody's misunderstood Scripture. That's never a great claim to make in terms of the Bible, especially when you basically have that much evidence standing against you and there's not really leg to stand on. So what about then this idea that open theism hinges on anthropomorphisms? That's the idea that God acts like a man in the Old Testament. So I want to go ahead and read Boyd's quote, who's one of the top open theists. And I want to read his quote. He says this. This is Boyd, open theist. Quote, first, there are certainly passages in the Bible that are figurative and portray God in human terms. You can recognize them because what is said about God is either ridiculous if taken literally or because the entire genre of the passage is poetic. However, there's nothing ridiculous or poetic about the way the Bible repeatedly speaks about God changing his mind, regretting decisions, or thinking and speaking about the future in terms of possibilities. Now, this is really important because you might think, oh, well, that makes sense, except for this. He just said it right in there. The rabbis distinguish the difference between, the rabbis argue there is a difference between physical anthropomorphisms and non-physical anthropomorphisms. In other words, you can have both. The openness view rejects physical anthropomorphisms. In other words, God's looking like a man, but they fully accept mental and emotional anthropomorphisms as literal. The rabbis don't. The rabbis, oddly enough, do love anthropomorphisms, but they don't take them literally. They believe they were really teaching devices. And so the modern rabbis typically give two reasons for this. One, they argue they're necessary because of human limitations, language, and understanding. I think that's generally true. I think the bottom line is when you have God trying to talk to Abraham, sure, go ahead and approach Abraham like as the divine being unfiltered. And, what would that even look like? I mean, again, you have this problem where God is transcendent. And so in order to essentially bridge that gap and communicate with us, he has to condescend himself. In other words, he has to come down and in some way portray himself human-like so that we can even understand him. Okay. So the second one is that they relay the doctrine of the imitation of God, which essentially shows God as obeying his own commands. In other words, why should you be just? Because God is just. Why should you be holy? Because God is holy. Right? So you get this interesting kind of parallel. Well, why should you do something? Because God does that thing. And that's very, very common in these anthropomorphisms. Additionally, the rabbis often tend to soften or remove anthropomorphisms, the Targums especially. And here's a great example of the rabbis on the rainbow, page 39. This is actually a fun little read here. Give me a second here. All right. 1 second. 38. Okay. I might have to sneeze. Sorry if I do. Do I have to sneeze? That's a good question. Excuse me. I did have to sneeze. Okay. All right. Alan J. Repeck states, quote, for instance, rather than God's surprise at human sinfulness described in Genesis 6, 5-6, which leads to God bringing a flood, Genesis 6, 6, the rabbis understood the rainbow to have been created before the first Sabbath. This means that God already knew that people would sin and there would be a flood, and that afterwards God would promise never again to destroy the earth and would offer a rainbow as a sign of that commitment. In the rabbinic view, there are no surprises for God, end quote. So again, just showing this, right? Boyd's comment then on Genesis 6, 6, quote, doesn't the fact that God regretted the way things turn out, or to the point of starting over, suggest it wasn't a foregone conclusion at the time God created human beings that they would fall into the state of wickedness? This mirrors the argument, interesting enough, of a Gentile who denied God's foreknowledge to Rabbi Joshua ben Korah. And I'll go ahead and read this. This is kind of a funny argument. Gentile, quote, do you not maintain that the Holy One, blessed is he, sees what is going to happen? Rabbi, indeed so. Gentile, but lo, it is written, and it grieved him in his heart, Genesis 6, 6. Rabbi, did you ever have a son? Gentile, I'll say this, guys, in the middle of this. Reading rabbinic literature that's like this, these dialogues, is actually a lot of fun. It's fun stuff. It's fun stuff. Did you ever have a son? Gentile, yes. Rabbi, and what did you do? Gentile, I was happy, and I made everybody happy. Excuse me. Rabbi, but did you not know in the end that he would die? Gentile, rejoice in the time of joy, mourn in the time of mourning. Again, it proves the point, right? Rabbi, and that is the way things are done before the Holy One, blessed is he. or blessed be he. For Rabbi Joshua ben Levi said, for 7 days the Holy One, blessed be he, went into mourning for his world before he brought the flood. As it is said, and it grieved him in his heart. And further it says, for the king grieved for his son, 2 Samuel 19:3. So basically, they interpret this anthropomorphically, and they don't reject God's foreknowledge. So it's interesting to see this, that what we essentially have in the rabbinic literature stands in support of the sovereignty of God, the foreordination of God, the foreknowledge of God. And it doesn't have anything to do with Greek philosophy or Greek thought. This is just what they've been gleaning from the scriptures themselves. And so in conclusion, I would argue that the historical claims of openness movement are misinformed. The rabbis followed essentially the Hebrew scriptures, not Plato and Aristotle. The rabbis maintained, again, foreordination and foreknowledge, even of future actions, and they typically saw anthropomorphisms as figurative, both the physical part and the emotional mental part. And so with that, that's essentially what I wanted to cover tonight. So that's where we're going next time. We are going to take a break. We're going to be taking a break for the holidays. We're going to come back either first or second week in January. You can stay tuned. I'll put a post up. But we're going to take a look at orthodoxy and open theism and the connection to Western philosophical traditions. That's going to be next in our list. Additionally, in the future, after this series is done, we are going to be doing this book in full. This is Pierced for Our Transgressions. It is a phenomenal book defending penal substitutionary atonement, and we are going to be doing a deep dive on penal substitutionary atonement after we deal with the issue of open theism. So I'm looking forward to that, but we've got a bunch of good things coming here for the new year. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and post a Zoom link for those who would like to join us for a Zoom call, because, hey, why not? I love my Zoom calls. We do have fun in our Zoom calls. So give me just one minute here to get this set up. And go ahead and just hang in the waiting room. It's the best place to hang. Let's see here. We want that one right there, and we want the link. Okay. Okay, there it is. All right, there's the Zoom call. Feel free and join. I look forward to seeing you guys there. Again, thank you so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on the critique of open theism, rabbinic theology, and open theism. I hope you have a wonderful evening.